So good morning to our audience on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. We're really pleased to have you with us this morning for this Ask the CSA session, and even more so with Bruce Levy in attendance this morning. We're really excited to have Bruce with us this morning. And I want to just jump right in. So let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Keisha Farnham. I'm the Director for Public Sector Projects with the CCSA. But more importantly, I want to introduce Bruce, our guest of honor. And so Bruce has worked with the power and energy industry for more than 35 years. Prior to founding BMR Energy, he was the CEO of International Power's North America IPP business, responsible for over 7,000 megawatts of oil, gas, coal, wind, and solar power generation throughout the region. And before IP, he also served as the CFO of GPU Inc., an electricity utility company serving over 2 million customers in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And previous to that, he was the president and CEO of GPU International, a non-regulated subsidiary of IP that developed, acquired, and operated generation and utility systems through the US, South America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. So there's no doubt that Bruce is the perfect person to be talking to about the energy transition. Welcome, Bruce. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Great, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So Bruce, as promised, I want to jump right in. We know that there is a commitment to renewable energy transition in the region. So for example, in 2015, the CARICOM Secretariat commissioned the Caribbean Sustainable Energy Roadmap and Strategy. And that strategy was designed to build on existing efforts in the region to provide CARICOM member states with a coherent strategy for transitioning to sustainable energy. The baseline assessment and report that resulted from that study did an analysis of the region's current energy and energy policy situation, an evaluation of the regional potential for renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions within the region, and then of course provided recommendations for targets not only in the long term, but also in the short and medium term. And then at the national level, we see the commitment of individual countries as detailed in their nationally determined contributions. And of course, at the regional level, we also see this commitment and this recognition for transition. So for example, the CDB president, Jean Leon, he said that the Caribbean needs to install 320 megawatts of new renewable power each year, compared with the 25 megawatts installed across the region in the last 9 years. And this 320 megawatts will require an annual investment of $1.2 billion. So we have the strategies, we have the need outlined, we have the commitment from countries. So I guess the question here is, why aren't we moving in that direction as quickly as we would want to? Why isn't it happening for us the way that we would want? Could you give me maybe 2 or 3 good reasons as to why you think we're not moving in this direction, even though there seems to be apparent commitment throughout the region?
Well, that's a big question. There are a few basic things that I think are reasonably explainable, and then you have the more difficult to explain reasons. If you think about back through 2017, where most of the renewable commitments in the Caribbean have been made, in 2017 we had 2 big hurricanes that did some significant damage, followed by another one in 2019. And that really turned everybody's attention in the Caribbean, the governments, the utilities, and the residents, of course, to resiliency. And, what do we do instead of just the same thing that gets destroyed every time there's a storm? So there was almost a 2-year, 3-year timeout for this whole focus on resiliency and how do you do everything with a resilient outlook, including new energy and new power plants and renewable power plants. So that's one, I guess, a very understandable reason. And unfortunately, right after that 2.5 year period after the hurricanes, along came COVID, which then put everybody on their heels and thinking about not renewable energy or energy anything, but thinking about remote education, remote work, getting their internets better to be able to support all that. So those were 2 real events that no one could have foreseen and no one can really manage any differently. The real question is, now that those are essentially behind us, I don't think we're done with hurricanes, I don't think we're done with COVID, but
Yeah.
we have a way to at least a better understanding of them. What's the momentum, what's going to take to get the momentum built up again to start getting some of these commitments to renewable energy implemented? And I think then you get into two, the harder to explain. One is some islands just aren't sure how to do it. And the other is when you replace something, you have to figure out what to do with the old one you had. The good news for many Caribbean islands is they have a utility plant that is pretty old and pretty, run down because it's in 20, 30, 40 years. It's not as efficient as it could be. So there is opportunity to upgrade with not just replacement equipment, but also with renewable equipment. So there's a lot of opportunity. It's a matter of governments and private industry taking the action to grab that opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, and you have to also take into consideration the specific situations of each of the countries too. So even though we're talking about a regional transition, some countries are more in a position to move forward with RE because they don't have an infrastructure of oil and gas, right? So when you look at Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Guyana, their infrastructure is different. The economies are based on a different type, there's a difference, right? So there's also that to be considered on a country by country basis, even though we're looking at this transition regionally.
Well, I disagree. I disagree with that.
Tell me.
Okay. And I think I would separate Trinidad from Guyana and Suriname, because those Guyana and Suriname have a lot of development to do in their infrastructure, because now that at least Guyana's found some oil, they've got a bigger challenge is how to take that oil benefit, the revenue, and use it to build their country. And I think they can put a lot of renewables in, and they have gotten a nice grant from I guess it was the Norway government, and they're funding a bunch of solar plants. But if you look at Trinidad has a lot of oil and gas. They subsidize their electric rates significantly using that money. And the question is that the highest use of oil and gas right now? They could sell it. They could use it to make methanol and export methanol, and all those things can also be of value to Trinidad if they use more of their renewable resources. They have almost none being used. They did do an RFP back in the 2017-18 timeframe. That is not, they've awarded 100+ megawatts to a company, but it's yet to be built. So there is a lot of opportunity for Trinidad to kind of rethink how they're allocating their fuel, oil, and gas riches. And instead of wasting it, maybe it's not a waste to them, on subsidizing electricity, I'd use it for a higher purpose and use more renewables. There is a great opportunity in Trinidad.
So there's a mix, there's a mixed bag. So since you opened the door with Guyana, one of the arguments that has been heard is that, asking Guyana not to develop their oil and gas industry is unfair at this point. And they have made a commitment publicly to making sure that they have a mixed bag in terms of their energy needs. What are your thoughts on that?
I think oil and gas can coexist with renewable energy. The issue is to use the oil and gas in the best possible way so you don't use as much of it. I think Guyana has lots of opportunity for solar and wind, but their wind resource isn't so good and their solar resource is not so good. One of the problems of being a rainforest is you have a lot of rain. And so they'll be able to save some energy, some fuel oil by using that renewable, but it's not going to be the cheapest renewable that you could do. Many of the other countries in the Caribbean have much better resources, and you can see it on what you expect to generate from each of those. For the same investment, you'd probably generate 50% more or 30% more solar power if you built a plant in Trinidad than if you built it in Guyana, simply because of the weather and the solar irradiation in those areas.
Got it. Okay, thanks for that. So looking at, we identified that there is a gap, we identify what needs to happen. And I know that you've been working within the region for a while now. So you've been attempting to close that gap. What do you think have been some of your high points? What are you proud of?
Well, clearly, I think Jamaica is a shining example. They as I said earlier, they've been on a couple of 3-4 year hiatus while they've dealt with issues, but they do have a plan for an RFP. But I think Jamaica really has made set an example for the things you need to do to encourage renewable energy. They adopted all the tariff kind of exemptions for renewable equipment. They've set up bidding programs. They had one pretty often every year and a half or so prior to the last auction. I guess they had was 2016. And they really created an environment where the utility was on board, maybe reluctantly, but on board. The government was on board. Our plant there is on a land we leased from the government. So the government used land they didn't have any other use for and is getting some benefit in lease payments. But the bigger benefit is renewable energy. And our plant there was started building in 2015, went online in 2016, and it's been operating, exemplary fashion since then, beating all expectations, very high availability, despite things going wrong like they always do on plants. So that's a great high point. I think another one that I would point to for us is our just about complete rebuild of a solar plant that was completely destroyed by a hurricane in 2017 on St. Thomas. I mean, it looked like an erector set that someone picked up and dropped back on the ground. It took 6 months to cart all the rubble away. And it was in a tough place, and it was built, I guess, using older standards and wasn't capable of dealing with the 180 plus mile an hour wind. And so we've now, it's just about where it's in its performance test this week, finished rebuilding that plant with capability to withstand 180 mile plus hour winds and bigger capacity, more output, just using more efficient panels and using less land, actually, because the panels are bigger. We could do this bigger output with less land. So that's the type of thing that now can be done. The industry is smarter about hurricanes and corrosion and all the things you have to deal with in the Caribbean, and the technologies come further to help us deal with that.
I know we had some really interesting conversations at CREF in April. And one of the things that came up was this resiliency gap. So after a hurricane, being able to build back better, what would that cost? Because you could replace the infrastructure, and that is a fixed cost. Of course, it's less, but if you wanted to build back in a more resilient manner, as you said, to be able to withstand winds from a Category 5 hurricane, what would that cost? So you don't have to share exact numbers, but in terms of building back that plant, do you feel that there is a just argument, one, for the resiliency cost gap and taking that into consideration when accessing funding? And what do you feel like are the margins between just building back and building back better?
Well, the cost is higher, but not significantly higher. It really goes into how you think about it. And as I said, the solar panel manufacturers have actually got on board and now make more rigid panels that could withstand the wind. You have to spend more time putting the foundations, the racking in to hold the solar panels. So maybe it costs 5 or 7% more to build. Same thing on wind is, I'm trying to think what they call it, Class 3 wind turbines that are good for 120 mile an hour winds, and there's Class 1 wind turbines that are good for 140 plus mile an hour winds, and now they make even a typhoon rated wind turbine. The good news is that the wind industry is kind of moving more towards Class 1, but the smaller islands, it's going to be hard for them to get Class 1 turbines because the turbines are getting bigger. And so the smaller turbines, when I say smaller, I mean less than 1 megawatt, are going to be Class 3, which will still survive in many islands, certainly in the Western Caribbean, but the Eastern Caribbean, it's going to be more challenging.
Gotcha. Talking about the smaller islands, Cayman just announced that they would be investing in their own project development at utility scale. I was wondering, what were your thoughts on that? Do you think that they can be an example for other countries with a high credit rating?
I have mixed feelings on that.
Do tell.
I think the challenge most of the islands have, most of the countries, is and Cayman is a great example. They went through a formal process. They did an IRP. It's one of the better IRPs I've seen in the Caribbean. They came out with a procurement program, and they, were ready to kick it off when COVID hit. So now COVID's back, and so they've kicked it off again. And there's a thinking of at least some of the politicians, although I've heard all kinds of rumors where the ideas came from, that it would be cheaper for the energy if they built it with government money, because their credit rating's so good and they get lower cost debt. And I would say when I do a project in the Cayman, I get lower cost debt because it's the Cayman and it's got an A rated or an investment grade rated utility than I do when I'm getting financing in other islands. So there already is a benefit. I think the challenge the Cayman has is that it's a tough place to build. Land is very, very expensive. It's coral, and so it's hard to put foundations for wind towers and even solar plants in coral. And it's some of the things that make it really nice or make it difficult to build. Our plant in the Caymans is built on an old quarry, so the land was already disturbed. But there's other places on the Caymans where you could build. So money is not a problem in the Caymans. Really, the issue is getting the right lots, setting the right rules of what type of land you can use for renewables. And but I don't think the Caymans will save a lot of money by having the government fund the renewable energy. They don't have the expertise. They have some folks on the island that have clearly expertise in installing industrial rooftop and some small ground mounted, but large utility scale requires an expertise on how to do it and how to build it and how to manage it and how to operate it. And the government doesn't have that experience, so they're going to need to buy that, and that's going to cost some money. So I think in the end, they're not going to necessarily save a lot. And I can tell you already that the decision to do that has basically put the entire procurement process they had started on hold. So it's probably going to cost them a year. And at the end, it might be done with private investment anyway.
Private. So in your opinion, private investment would have probably been the best way to go to start, because they have that in an enabling environment.
Right. I mean, the government can do things to lower price if that's what they want. There really is not much in the way of tax, but they could provide land at a discount. I mean, you could use their money for that, because land is a really expensive part of the equation in the Cayman.
So I think that nicely opens the door to talk about the right incentives and what else you're seeing happening. Where are things going right in the world? What's that enabling environment that creates the perfect space for this type of transition? Our listeners on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, use the Ask CCSA hashtag and ask your questions. We'll be looking out for them. We'll definitely leave some room at the end of this discussion to answer questions. But Bruce, just thinking about what is the right environment? What's the enabling environment? What are those key critical things that need to come together to make sure that, the transition happens? And where are you seeing it? So moving out of the region and possibly globally, where are you seeing these things moving in the right direction?
Well, okay. The good news is I have some examples. So, a transition like this really requires a national commitment, and not just a commitment to do it, but to encourage all the infrastructure beneath them to go along with it. And that's often been some of the bottlenecks. Like, for example, some countries get a good portion of their revenue from fuel tax on oil, tax on gas. And so there's a cost to them of converting more of their energy use to renewables, because there's no tax on renewables, because there's nothing being imported. The sun and the wind are there anyway. And so there are forces at work way below the surface saying, gee, maybe we shouldn't rush into this, because that'll reduce the amount of oil we use on making electricity, or the amount of gas we use on making electricity, and drive it, and we'll lose some tax revenue. So how do you deal with that? So that's why you need like a real focus from the top down of the government to say, hey, look, we've made a commitment to renewables and we want to do it, and so therefore we'll figure out another way to fill that tax revenue hole, whatever that way is. But I'll give you an example of something I've learned in my 10 years down here, and that is sometimes the most successful processes don't follow a process. And one example I'd say right now is the soon-to-be shining star in the Caribbean for renewable is the Dominican Republic. And I started down in the Caribbean around 2014, 13. I guess my first visit was 2012. And the Dominican Republic had given out like 35 contracts for renewable energy, and none of it was getting built. It was kind of an interesting situation where people signed a contract and immediately sold it to a developer who wanted to put a little money in it and sell it to another developer. And it was more of a transactional of PPAs. There was nothing getting built, but people were buying PPAs from other people. And finally, the government got tired of it, and they said, look, we can't keep approving these changes in ownership. So of those 35 or so PPAs that are given out, to date, maybe 7 of them projects have been built. But the Dominican government has made a commitment to renewables, but not solely to renewables. They were also just finished a few years ago a coal plant, and they just finished building. They're out for bids now on a new gas plant. And they could do that because their economy and their electric load is growing. Their tourism is growing. A lot of islands have experienced that, but they have growth in all their sectors. And so rather than run a bid, because they don't really have the rules set up for a bid, they're now they have a process that they've forced all developers to go through to develop, get a piece of land and get a concession, a preliminary concession, and get your permits, do your studies, do your preliminary engineer. And in the last, I would say 6 months, they've given out 700 megawatts worth of, final concessions and PPAs to go with it. So we're going to see maybe 1,000 megawatts of new renewables built in the Dominican Republic, but not through any process that you could plan on or be ready for. It was just the folks that are getting these concessions were just slogging away on projects, not having a clear path to a PPA, but they, I guess, had faith in the government that they were going to get there. And so now all these developers that have spent all this time doing that are now have an opportunity to build their projects. So I think that's a good example. I think there's potential in the Cayman if they get their program back on track, because their goal was to get up to 70% renewable within 10 years. So it's pretty aggressive. Puerto Rico has a very aggressive program to get to 50% in let's say 10 years by the time the plants are built. They have other issues to deal with. The utility is going through a restructuring and has debt problems. But I think there are a couple of real focused governments that are really pushing to get renewable, and they to get around the groups within the government and within the country that are against it. They've just dealt with it either through creating other ways to address issues. Whereas the other end of that, and I hope this is changing, I think it might be, is the Barbados. Barbados made a big announcement 5-6 years ago when Mia Motley took over. They were going 100% renewable. And there's a lot of people who have been down there developing projects, finding sites, putting in permit applications. And the process of getting them through the regulatory rules and the utility interconnection rules and the contracting rules has not been pushed through with the same level of commitment as the high level of commitment. And so much less has been built than could have been. I guess it seems like they're getting there, but it's taken quite a long time. And as a result, they have not made their goal to well, it's unlikely they'll make their goal to be at 100% renewable by 2030. I guess it's possible, but it's unlikely.
Yeah.
But that's an example of when, you can't just say we want it to happen and it happens. You have to work the system. You have to work your agencies. You have to work your tax groups. You have to work your customs people. Just getting things through customs on some countries is very difficult. So it's quite a contrast. If you look from island to island, many of them have the same aspiration, but some are achieving it, some are going through the steps to achieve it, and some are trying to figure out how to go through the steps to achieve it.
Yeah, that synergy between government agencies and that collaboration, I think, is critical, because exactly as you said, the commitment from up high is there. The commitment is in writing in the indices, but getting the actual at the operational level, the day-to-day nitty-gritty, as they say, getting documents signed, getting permits approved, all of those things are in most islands take a lot longer than they should. And for a lot of private developers, particularly, time is money, so it really is important to have that congruence between what's happening at the top, the commitments at the national level, but also have the agencies that would make the ball roll along smoothly, all working together and in tandem with each other. Well, it's easy to be pessimistic about the future. I mean, when we look at what needs to happen and the speed at which it is happening, it is a little bit disconcerting. And then, when you also look at, there's also the argument that, renewable energy installations, or the cost is going up. And then when we talk about supply chain issues, the cost is also going up. But I had the pleasure of hearing you present at CARILEC in May. And from all indicators, there is still tremendous growth in renewables that outpaces any other energy development. And so I guess the question would be, aren't traditional sources of energy in relative decline, as it relates to renewable energy? And even though the cost of renewable energy installations have gone up, how do they look in, when you compare them with, oil and gas, et cetera? So is there reason to be optimistic?
First I'll talk about some of the facts. That there has been more new oil and gas plants built in the Caribbean in the last 3 to 5 years than there has been renewables. They're still building it. They're replacing the old, they're upgrading. And Jamaica, I use that as an example because as I said, they're one of the great examples, but of renewable adoption. But they've built, between me and the other developers, 4 or 5 others that have built plants there, maybe we built 150 megawatts of renewable wind and solar. Maybe when you put in, rooftops and things people have done at home, another 20 or 30 megawatts. But in that same time, they've converted their plants in Montego Bay to natural gas from oil, but they haven't replaced them. They've replaced their Old Harbor plant with a brand new 190 megawatt gas-fired plant. They replaced some of they built a new cogen plant at Jamalco, another 90 megawatts of gas. And they've just approved them replacing another 170 megawatts of oil and gas with oil and gas, well, mostly gas. So even in Jamaica, where there is a big, clear focus on renewables, they're going ahead and they're building oil and gas. Antigua is just putting in a gas delivery terminal so they can convert all their generators to gas and upgrade them. If you go over to Central America, El Salvador just put in a 350 megawatt gas-fired facility. So I wouldn't say gas and oil is going away. Hopefully oil is going away because it's dirtier, it's more expensive, it's more volatile in the market. But the thing that has changed, and it's changed over the last year and a half, but even more so in the last half year, is renewable energy is much, much cheaper than oil. So if anybody needed a reason to switch to some of their generation to oil, to solar or wind, the actual cost, not of the whole investment, but the fuel that you'd have to spend in a fuel plant versus the entire cost of a solar plant The solar plant is about half the cost per kilowatt hour. So significant savings. And it had been that way in the 2014, 15, 16 timeframe when oil prices have been high, but then oil prices dropped down, and the all-in cost of a solar plant and the cost of the oil you burn in an oil plant were kind of at parity. And so the savings wasn't really as compelling. It was a little cheaper. It was certainly cleaner. You reduced your, how much currency you were paying out to pay for oil each year. But now, because oil seems to be settling in at around $100 a barrel, it sometimes goes above it, sometimes goes a little lower, but it's reset from the 40 to 50 it's been at for the last 4 or 5 years. And solar and wind, while they've gone up a little due to supply chain issues, they've only gone up, if the all-in cost of a plant maybe has gone up 10 or 12%. And so you're now seeing, if your cost of oil in a per kilowatt is going to be 12 cents, the price of solar is going to be 6 cents. It's significantly lower. So that's a trend that I think will push people to move more rapidly towards renewable energy.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring it in a little closer to home for me. So for CCSA, that we have some initiatives that we're collaborating on, some of them. So let's look at some of those, and I would love to get your thoughts, good, bad, or indifferent, on all of them. So the solar assembly project, what do you understand? What are your thoughts?
Well, the concept there, it's been used in a number of places. Solar plants, if you ever get into they look like big flat panel. They're 2 meters by 1 meter, and inside them there's 72 solar cells and a piece of glass and lots of other wires and stuff to make them work. So there's 2 pieces of making a solar plant panel. One is making solar cells, which is a very high tech and big investment type project. And the other is assembling the solar plant. So the concept is, if you do that locally, you save a lot in shipping. You don't have to fill up a whole boat with solar panels, which is really just steel, aluminum, and glass, plus all the solar cells. So the concept has been talked about, and they've tried it in the States, they've tried it in other places, to say, let's make an assembly plant closer to the demand. And we could assemble solar panels. We import the same, we're gonna have to import the glass, we're gonna have to, maybe you can make glass locally, we're gonna have to import the frames and the other structures, but we can assemble it there and save some shipping and give some local jobs. I think the challenge that we'll find is, the competitiveness of doing that. Because while it certainly will save on some shipping, and shipping is much more expensive than it had been, whether those solar panels assembled at that plant can compete with ones delivered already assembled from Asia. Because right now it's going to be tough, because Asia's got these mega factories. And if they could produce in a day what this assembly plant will produce in a month, and so you've got some significant issues. I don't think anybody will be willing to pay noticeably more for panels assembled in the Caribbean. It just makes it harder to justify the investment when you're not saving as much energy on your energy costs as you could. So that's going to be the challenge, and I think it's doable, but it's a matter of can we have to prove it can be done.
Prove that it can be done. Do you think that commitment from individual companies to reduce their own carbon footprint could possibly impact their decision in wanting to nearshore this type of facility?
It's an interesting trend we see. The developed nations, Europe, the US, Australia to some extent, have, the big corporations there have all made very big commitments to clean up and be more efficient. The ESG standard, the environmental, social, and governance issues, it's a big issue. It's included. I renewed my insurance on my power plant. I had to fill out a ESG survey because some insurers would only insure people that got certain scores on that survey. So it's becoming a bigger and bigger thing. Has not caught on as much in the lesser developed world, Asia, it's not such a big thing, and South America and the Caribbean, people are, and I should say why, because it costs a lot more to do things ESG. You have to, only buy from manufacturers that also do ESG, and those manufacturers are going to charge you more. And so maybe if you're a big enough company and you can get economies of scale somewhere else, you can do that, but it's very hard to do that in smaller or less developed countries. So I haven't seen people really being willing to pay for things like emission credits. In the United States, if you want to build a plant, in New York City, for example, they fine you, they fine buildings millions of dollars a year if they haven't reduced their carbon emissions. And so you've got lots of investment going on in buildings to take out old boilers and putting electric heat pumps in, which will significantly reduce carbon emissions, not because they are great economic investments, they're pretty good economic investments, but because the city of New York will fine you if you don't. And that's a commitment that not many cities have made. Many cities have made, but not all cities have made. And I think those are the things that, if they start becoming a reality in the Caribbean, you'll see a lot more transition to renewable energy. But it comes at a cost. And
it does. It does. What about the Caribbean blended finance for resilience? Same question.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think there's a real role for something like that, really, really to focus on I'd say, I'll call them smaller projects, and I guess small is always relevant, but there's lots of financing around for utility scale projects, 20 megawatts and above. It's harder to finance projects that are smaller. And sometimes they're smaller because it's a smaller island. Sometimes they're smaller because it's a community focused renewable energy, and it's only 2 or 3 or 4 megawatts. And it's hard to get financing, and without financing, it's hard to build. So I think having a facility like the blended facility that can focus on those types of investments, those types of solar investment, and it's probably be solar because typically the smaller units are solar, but there's other technologies that might play a role. I think that is going to really help get it done at a grassroots level, which is just as important as the utility scale level.
Agreed, because if we're talking about a just energy transition, we need to make sure that it's exactly not only at the utility scale level, but also at the grassroots level. And then finally, the Caribbean single energy export market, which is fairly new for us. We would have exported this at the recent energy conference in Trinidad. What are your thoughts? We're just starting on this journey. It's a heavy lift, but love to get your input.
I think that would require a great deal of cooperation between the islands. And you don't see that really working on anything else. You have CARICOM, you have CARILEC. There is some sharing of practices and some sharing of resources between those. And it really helps the electric side, because there's a storm that hits one island, the other islands will send resources, whether it's trucks or supplies, to help the damaged islands recover. But other than those types of emergency focused collaboration, it's hard to imagine a Caribbean-wide collaboration of the scale that is discussed. And it tends to come out of the ideas of larger islands, and at the expense of smaller islands, because they'll have less to say. So I think that's a tougher challenge. You might get 2 big islands to cooperate. First steps of doing something like that. But I find that even within a single island, it's hard to get the 2 opposing parties to agree with each other, and how to get a bunch of islands to create some common market, which is what you're talking about, would be difficult. And if you look at the example of the EU, I mean, what you find in the EU, the challenge is the Germany and France like the EU because they get to kind of run it, and the other countries, I was in Greece once, and some guy is saying, I can't believe they won't let me export my whatever he was making, because they want it made in Bulgaria. They don't want it made in Greece, and so those types of things tend to create difficulty. So it's a real big challenge.
Yeah. Well, we'll let you know how we accomplish it when we accomplish it. But I think, it segues really nicely into the question about collaboration, right? So in your opinion, how could we work more collaboratively to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve as a region? I know that you have worked in the region for a while. What are some of the things, positive, negative, that you would think you would want to share with us today about doing business in the region? So first, how could we work more collaboratively? Secondly, based on your experience of doing business, because sometimes we have project holders listening in, but also investors. What are some of the things that you want to share with us today?
Well, I have to say we've been very pleased to find throughout the Caribbean some really high quality engineering firms and construction firms. And so there are some foreign companies that say, well, we'll bring our team down from wherever they are and they'll build this and it'll go smoothly. But it won't go smoothly because you have to deal with all the local issues. And so we have made it a practice of using as much local labor, engineering, and even supporting our operations, local contractors as possible. But it is a challenge to find them because for every good one we find a couple that aren't so good. And they're not good at nothing. They're just, our industry, the electric industry is a pretty high tech industry. And now with all the electronics and the communications, so you really have to get someone who knows it. And we've never had a problem finding them. It's a matter of looking for them and knowing what to look for. So I think, and that helps us because it's very important to make the people in the islands think that there's something in it for them other than lower electric rates, because as they always tell us, they never see the lower electric rates. Like the utilities get lower electric costs, but it never really perks out to them. And so giving jobs and training and things like that is an important benefit that we think we should bring with us when we go into a new country.
Definitely. So we're closing in on question time soon. So I just want to encourage the audience to place your questions in the chat using the hashtag AskCCSA. Our audience on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, we're seeing the comments coming in. We really do appreciate your engagement. Bruce, you in 2019, you would have won the CREF Best Resilience Project Award. Can you talk about that project and probably tell us some of the specifics around that?
Yeah, well, it's something I mentioned a little earlier. There was a lot of projects built in the Caribbean in the 2014-15 timeframe. The U.S. Virgin Islands, where that project was on St. Croix, was one of the first in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They built, unfortunately, 5 solar plants, and all 5 were destroyed in the hurricane. Some were fully destroyed, some were partially destroyed, and it wasn't necessarily the fault of the people that built them. They weren't our plants. We ended up buying them and rebuilding them. It was the industry wasn't ready yet. They were building things for Europe and they were building things for the United States. But the environment in the Caribbean is very different, and it comes in 2 forms. The big one that you remember is the hurricanes, and the one that's there every day is the moisture. And you're never more than a mile from the ocean, and so there is almost nothing that doesn't corrode in a power plant in the Caribbean. And so we found that with the plant that it was a 5 megawatt solar plant, St. Croix. It wasn't, the solar panels were only partially damaged during the hurricane. That wasn't the real problem. The problem was all the electronics. Every piece of electronic in this plant was completely fried, corroded. I mean, what wasn't ruined by the hurricane was going to fail anyway because it was all rusty and the plant was 2 years old. Yeah. And so when we rebuilt it, we built it with, and the reason it happened is they put all the electronic equipment in a building, and I thought that would be good. But then they put ventilation on the building and kept bringing in outside air to cool things. And so you bring in, pretty salty, wet air, and it was just, was not a pretty sight. So we brought in, completely replaced all the equipment, all the electronic equipment with outdoor rated equipment, even though it's in a building, with special coatings for salt and corrosion. And that plant got back up and running 4 months after we took it over. And it's run pretty reliably since. And you go to a plant today and it doesn't look any different than it looked, it's now 4 years when we rebuilt it. It's really withstanding the corrosion and the moisture and all that. I mean, there's all kinds of things you have to deal with plants. We have occasionally someone shoots a golf ball at the solar plants, and we find a plant with a crack in it with a golf ball next to it. So you have to deal with those. But weather resilience and Caribbean, circumstance resilience, I think we're much better. And we've used that experience as when we rebuilt the St. Thomas plant, and all our plants built after that are built, with special coatings on. A lot of the enclosures now are, they went from carbon steel galvanized to stainless steel, and now they use plastic, and they have these new plastics that are much tougher than steel, or as tough as steel, but there's no corrosion issues at all. So we've been improving our designs. Each plant we build is a little better, and it's not just because we're great. That's because the equipment suppliers are now making things that you can use that are better. And I think that's the resilience. You talk about resilience in a lot of ways, but resilience gets down to which bolts you use and what kind of washers you use, because you could have a nice stainless steel bolt if you don't use a stainless steel washer, the washer corrodes away and things get loose and they don't work. We also put in operating procedures. We go around and tighten every bolt on the solar plant, and there's a lot of bolts, like hundreds of thousands of bolts holding the racking together. Every year we go around and basically we're continuing tightening bolts, because hurricanes don't always destroy things, but they sure loosen bolts.
Yeah.
And so no one did that, because no one thought, we put one of these in Kansas and they just sit there and work forever, even though they have hurricanes, they have tornadoes.
It's a different weather.
Yeah.
It's different weather.
So I think just that understanding what the requirements are to survive in the Caribbean is something, unfortunately, we had to learn the hard way. The industry had to learn the hard way. And so I don't know, I wouldn't say we're the leader in resilience design, but we certainly don't ever build anything that would not last through a hurricane and the continued really beautiful weather, but it's humid in the Caribbean.
And so it comes down to the nuts and bolts of things, pun intended. But that is something not just for renewable energy solutions, but any type of innovative solution that's being brought to the region that has been trial tested, works somewhere else. I think that's something that I always alert the companies to. It's like, yes, it worked really well in this environment, but will it work, under the conditions of the Caribbean, with the sea salt in particular, and the corrosion? So before we jump into the questions, I think for me, I really want to get your thoughts on, what should people be thinking about that they're probably not thinking about as yet? What is the next great innovation in clean technology, in your opinion? And then we will segue into questions from the audience. So our audience on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, just use the hashtag AskCCSA, put your question in the chat, and we'll get to it in a few minutes.
Well, I think the interesting, the latest thing or the newest thing is not necessarily a technology issue. It's a mindset issue. And if you look at, and it's kind of viewed as heresy by some people, but it's, what if it was a requirement, if you built anything in the Caribbean, to actually build in renewable energy? So every house, like for California, adopted a statute that, any new houses in California have to be built with renewable energy, solar panels on the roof. And what's the part of the renewable energy evolution in the Caribbean that's not documented very well is how many homeowners have put renewable panels on their roofs. And this is an area where the wealthier countries are doing this a lot more, and it's not necessarily fair that the wealthy people could put it on and avoid paying the high electric prices, and the not so wealthy people can't. But I think the kind of socializing the use of renewable energy, it should be a kind of a basic thing that everyone does, and there should be standards and rules and designs so that everybody's not figuring out how to do it. And I think it's starting to happen. I mean, if you look at the biggest growth of renewable energy during the pandemic was the amount of solar panels put on households in Puerto Rico, in Jamaica, in the Cayman. It's just, the contractors were working nonstop because people had a lot of spare time. They're working from home. They were able to look at it. They were there to be home for the contractors. And there was a lot of new construction of that. And I think while it still has to happen on a bigger scale to really make the transition happen, I think the grassroots level installation of renewable energy in a way that makes it resilient and is really, I think, going to be a piece that will change the future faster if it happens.
Excellent. So let's make sure that we get in some questions from the audience. Sigrid, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. Apologies if I'm not, on LinkedIn, asks, what do you see as the biggest bottlenecks to move into green energy? How do you see overcoming these bottlenecks?
Well, if I had to give one, I think one of the biggest bottlenecks is when governments make too aggressive a commitment, and whether it's 100% renewable or 70% renewable, without a plan to get there. And I think that what then happens, and it creates an environment where, you know, the people that really don't want it to happen can sit all day and just point to why that can't happen. We'll never be able to do that because our transmission line isn't strong enough, or what happens if a storm goes over and all the lights go out. And so I think if we made kind of a gradual commitment to, let's go to 20%, and we'll get to 20%, we'll figure out how we're going to get to 30% renewable. And when we get to 30%, figure out how to get to 40%. And while we're doing that, we'll understand the issues that might be preventing us from doing that. So if we are going to build a new power line somewhere, you might make it bigger. Or if you're going to build, you're going to want to put power plants in different places. And so the government could say, hey, we want power plants in the north. We're going to give, pay an extra 0.5 cents a kilowatt hour if the power plant's in the north, because that'll help us balance our grid. And I think that awareness and doing it, I'd say, more deliberately with a plan, as opposed to, we want 300 megawatts and we're going to go out for bid and we're going to take the lowest bids, because that you won't necessarily get what's best for the country, but you'll get the lowest bids. And that's clearly good, but it might not be as good as paying a bit more and having the plants in a different place on a different transmission line. So I think that's I think one of the biggest bottlenecks is setting goals that are so lofty, they're unachievable. And there's no clear path to get to the goal. I think, and again, I compliment Cayman, because they actually came out with a plan that said we're going to start at 25 megawatts, we're going to go to 50, we're going to go to 75, and they haven't, unfortunately, haven't been able to move forward on it for issues we talked about earlier. But I think that plan was one that people could, it's bite-sized, people could understand it. They're not throwing away everything they have to completely switch over, and it'd be more easy to socialize with folks and everybody feel comfortable.
So Ansel Bagwandine from Trinidad. Ansel is an innovator and inventor. Nice to have you, Ansel. He asks, we need to address battery repurposing as we're creating a huge new waste stream with aging batteries. So I know we haven't quite touched on this at all during our conversation. So your thoughts here, Bruce?
We will. There already are ways to recycle battery materials. The issue is, how do you make sure it happens? It's a similar problem with solar panels. You can't just throw a solar panel in a landfill. It's got, like the earlier solar panels were made with cadmium and arsenic and things like that. We no longer make them with that. They're made with much more inert materials, silica and such like that. But what do you do with the solar panel? So there is an industry, and there's the question is, are there enough rules around to make sure you have to do something with your old batteries or old solar plants, as opposed to shipping them back somewhere to have them disposed of, which costs money. And so I think we need rules I think the manufacturers would love to recycle lithium as opposed to keep mining it. There's technologies at work to try to figure out how to re-energize them so they could be reused in batteries. The real trick is to get into more common materials for batteries, and there's a lot of technology in that. But one of the reasons I didn't bring up batteries a lot is because it's not really ready for prime time on a big scale. I think the best place for batteries now would be for power quality, whether it's for a company to manage their own power needs so they don't get interruptions or frequency, changes, swings, or for someone who just has a little extra power that they can make during the day that they want to use, like, right after the sun goes down. The technology that a lot of people think is the holy grail, it's to make all your power during the day, store it in batteries and use it at night. You could do that, but it's going to require a lot of batteries and it's going to require a lot of expense. It's going to make it really expensive. So there's other technologies for storage. There's pumped water storage. There's molten salt storage. There's lots of money in R&D going into storage, addition to batteries that have longer life and lower replacement costs. But all the waste, for whether it's an old power plant or a new renewable plant or a battery plant, you have to figure out what to do with it when it's done. And I don't think we see a lot of solar batteries laying on the side of the road yet. Probably have 10 years before we have to worry about that. But
I would hope that we're putting solutions in place so that in 10 years we don't have to worry about that.
Well, there are solutions. They're expensive now. The cost will come down, but we also have to put the rules in place to make people have to.
There you go. Exactly. The policy has to be in place. Philbert, thanks for your question. So Philbert was asking, what countries does the CCSA operate in? Philbert, I will encourage you to visit our website. We have the list of countries there, but we're in 28 Caribbean countries. We are across the English, the Dutch, the French, and the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. There's a list of all the countries available there. It is likely that we will go up to 30 countries by the end of this year, early next year, but we're not taking on more than 30 at this point. But if a member of our team could possibly drop the link to our website in the chat, that would be very much appreciated. And Philbert, you can have a look there. We have another question from Sigrid. Are you working on renewable energy projects where rebuilding nature, like mangroves for carbon credits, are included? Integrated solutions to create a win-win for people, planet, and profit.
It's kind of interesting. Mangroves are a wonderful thing, and they really do just suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. And they make fish grow, and they're
pretty amazing. They hold the land, protect from hurricanes, everything. Yeah.
We tried a few years ago to try to put together a solar project and really use the solar project to pump water to feed the mangroves, because one of the problems that kills mangroves is the salt water kind of crawls in because of erosion, and because mangroves aren't as salty as the sea, and they're not freshwater, so you have to have that right balance of water. And this was a place in Jamaica where they used to grow sugarcane, and when they watered the sugarcane, the fresh water that watered sugarcane would run off into the ocean and keep the water not as salty, and the mangroves are really thriving there. But as like many islands, they're not growing as much sugarcane anymore, and they weren't watering the plants, and because of that, the salt was inching up and hurting the mangroves. So we were trying to work with one of the universities to put in a solar plant and use some of the power to pump water to not water the crops, but just water the mangroves. So they got more less saline. But it turns out the mangrove conservation is a really business in itself. There's a lot of grant money for that, and we were trying to use the savings, the carbon benefits of the mangroves to subsidize the whole plant. It turns out it didn't really fit with all the money that was going into mangrove restoration. Didn't want to be involved with building a solar plant to pump water to help the mangrove. So I think there's a whole industry of restoring mangroves, and it should get more support. But I haven't figured out a way yet to match up a solar plant or a renewable energy plant with mangrove restoration.
But you will,
Keep trying.
is what I'm hearing, that you were trying. So we're at the end of our time. This has really been an interesting discussion. We can't get to all the questions from the audience, but we will definitely respond to you via our social media platforms. I think what I would like to end on is, how could people get in touch with you, Bruce? I mean, we've just had a great conversation. You've really been a wealth of knowledge in terms of what's happening with RE in the region. Your company knows what they're doing in terms of installation. So if there was anybody who wanted to get in touch with you, how could we make that happen?
Okay, well, we have a website, bmrenergy.com. Mm-hmm. And you could also send us an email at info@bmrenergy.com.
Yeah.
Or you could send me an email, blevy@bmrenergy.com. But, try to use the other two first.
All right, great. Bruce, thank you so much for having this discussion with us. It was truly enjoyable. And we hope to have you again in the future. Any final words that you'd like to say before you leave?
I think like anything good, solar and renewable development in the Caribbean is hard work. Mm-hmm. And it requires, pushing and pushing and pushing. And, it's gratifying when it works and it's frustrating when it doesn't, but we're keeping at it. So I think we'll see some progress over the next couple of years.
Exactly. All right, great. Thank you so much, Bruce.
Okay, thank you.
All right.